Yeah, give me 1 second. All right, so we are good. Hello, everyone. My name is Will Careri. I am a MAASIN core member as well as tonight's moderator. MAASIN, or the Marching Arts Access, Safety, and Inclusion Network, is a community-led effort dedicated to increasing equality, equity, and safety in the marching arts. We believe in accessible, inclusive, and equitable marching arts for all in a culture of safety where scores, costs, or position of power are not prized over health or well-being. I want to thank you all for being here at our October Town Hall entitled Neurodiversity in the Marching Arts. I'm joined by a panel, each being a veteran to the marching arts, as well as having a connection to neurodivergent disorders, whether it be from a professional or personal experience. Tonight, we will be discussing what neurodiversity is, its current place in the marching arts, how organizations can better tailor to those who are neurodivergent, as well as how those who are neurodivergent can better prepare themselves within this activity. If the panelists would now like to take a moment to introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi, my name is Keegan Bosch. I am 27 years old. I'm a professor right now, an adjunct professor of communications. I'm currently preparing to hopefully do a PhD and stay in higher education and do some continued research on disabled voices in literature and, find any way I can to read books and get paid for it, but also talk about disability stuff. I marched Pioneer in 2013 and Phantom Regiment from 2014 through 2016, and then taught a number of organizations, both on instructional staff and support staff since then. So I've been around a lot of different places and seen a lot of different approaches to things. I'm excited to kind of hash out some of those.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Marco Iannelli. I am 21 years old. I am from Lebanon, Ohio, but I'm currently going to school at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where I am majoring in piano performance, co-majoring in film studies, and minoring in composition. I marched the Madison Scouts on tuba from 2018 until 2021, and I have been a synth player for Rhythm X since 2019. I am also now recently a designer in the marching arts. I will be speaking as a member of the autism community. I'm really excited to get this discussion going.
Well, I'm Alexandra Rathman. I'm 24. I marched with Jersey Surf in 2016 and 2018. I'm autistic, and I was diagnosed when I was very little. I also am working on my MSW, and I've experienced as a mental health worker. So I've also worked with neurodivergent children through that route. Plus, I am in my first year of teaching at a marching band, and that school district has a high level of neurodivergent children. So I hope to talk just a little bit from that perspective also, though I'm not really an expert quite yet.
My name is Claire Wilcox. I am 21 years old, and I go to Indiana University in Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana, where I study environmental and sustainability studies. I marched Phantom Regiment as head conductor from 2018 to 2021, and will be speaking from personal experience as a human with ADHD.
Great. Thank you all. As I mentioned, my name is Will Careri. I marched with Jersey Surf in 2014 and was a member of their media team in 2017. I am, above all, a mental health advocate, having given multiple talks about the topic, mostly speaking from my personal experience with depression and anxiety, although I have been recently diagnosed on the autism spectrum as well. Before we get into our discussion, I do want to give a brief definition of neurodiversity for those who may be unfamiliar. Neurodiversity is a term referring to the diversity of human brains and the wide variety of individual differences in our brain functioning, usually when referring to those with ADHD, autism, Tourette's, etc. This brings me to my first question. Panelists, the whole environment of the marching arts, whether it's marching band, drum corps, or a different ensemble, is centered around education. With this in mind, should students be taught differently if they are neurodiverse, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I think that educators' main goal, just in general, should be learning how to teach students with different learning styles, and catering to those different learning styles in whichever setting that they may be in. I think that that is a sign of a really talented educator, and I think that that includes all students, not just students who may be neurodiverse, but definitely students with neurodiversity should be approached with those conditions taken into account. Whether that means that some students need to learn and take frequent breaks, or some students maybe need different type of stimulus, things like that are definitely important to take into account when teaching at any level.
For sure. This is something I'm like really, I get turned about a lot, especially because I just did, after finishing my master's, I went back and did an education degree. And there's something weird about already being an educator for like 4 years and then taking undergrad education classes, particularly when you're autistic and taking like the required special education course for undergrad educators. So, you know, being 26 and autistic and everyone else in your class is like 18 and bright-eyed and means well. I get real turned about it. But basically, I think a lot of times in like education departments, especially, and you know, particularly in the last 20 years, the approach to teaching disabilities is like sort of ignoring them, like in an optimistic way, kind of, where people, you know, it comes up a lot with conversations about like person first or identity first language is somewhere where it comes up a ton, where, you know, generally like autistic folks tend to prefer identity first language, but pretty much every special education department approaches it with like, oh, you should use only person first language because it, you know, it doesn't define the person by their disability. And I think a lot of times, particularly in autism communities, we're like, okay, but I am like everything I do is in some way defined by disability. And like my existing is existing with disability in mind. And I think educators need to consider that more than we tend to, where I think a lot of times educators might confuse equity with equality and want to like, you know, approach teaching their students equally, but it's not always an equitable approach to treat every student equally, particularly with neurodivergent students who might, you know, like Claire said, need very specific things to succeed. But one of the great things about the marching arts specifically is like, usually your students know what they need. You know, it's a lot different in like an elementary setting when kids often are trying to like figure out what the heck's happening in general, let alone, you know, navigating the specifics of some disability. But I think a lot of times in like, you know, WGI, DCI for sure. And even now I'm seeing high school students are super aware of themselves at the high school age, which is awesome. But like your students probably know what they need. Just if you create a space where they feel safe telling you what that is, and they trust that you're going to actually like do it for them, then I think a lot of teachers would be surprised how much their students will like tell them exactly what they require without much prompting.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I agree with a lot of what Keegan's just said. I feel like this question of whether students being taught differently because of the disability, I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, obviously, if staff doesn't kind of like shape their pedagogy, their teaching pedagogy based on like their students, and especially those with with autism or ADHD, then it's not good. But on the other hand, if one like teaches someone with a neurological disorder differently than everyone else, then they have to be careful, because it could come off as we're treating this person differently than everybody else, even if it's for a positive, even if it's in a positive manner. It's still not exactly what someone with a disorder might want. As someone with autism, I know that in my experience, the way I like to put it is that it's less of how can I be taught differently, and more of how can staff members formulate their language based on, or how can they formulate their language so that everyone, including a neurodivergent person like myself, to like hear it and to be able to learn from it, and on top of that, also how can they be patient and accepting and understanding of their students who go through this, because a lot of times, at least coming from experience, we autistic people and just like neurodivergent people in general don't really ask to be treated differently or special than anybody else. We just ask for patience and for understanding if something is not applying to us right away.
So I really like everything that's being said, and you can probably tell I was getting excited. I could go on forever. Like, I will try not to, though. Okay, so especially what I like is the personal agency aspect. I agree with a lot with like allowing that student space to say like what they need, and like when you can get to know how that's, because even if you have like multiple autistic kids or multiple kids that have ADHD, they're not all going to be the same. And then, of course, like was already said, there's going to be the issue of not treating a student too different, because you have to assume competence also. Like, a lot of us have a lot of strengths learning. A lot of us learn very fast, I think. It's just really, I think, how the information is presented and case by case things, learning kind of how that student needs to learn. Like, for instance, for me, it's like I pick up on info fast, but you can't give me too many steps at once, and my auditory processing is whack, so you might just need to repeat yourself. But yeah, just case by case basis, consider the strengths of your students. And then if they're having challenges and it doesn't seem like they're soaking in information like we really want people to do in drunk core, like just be a sponge. If they're having difficulty with that, they're not doing it on purpose. Or like it could just be the mental challenges of that day. Hopefully that summed up my thoughts.
I really like that you mentioned like that day too. Like that came up right at the end, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's super important. Like some days I have absolutely no auditory processing issues, and other days, like every other word just sounds like nonsense. Like, it even within, and I think this is something that like happens a lot to autistic people, because we are often labeled by like functioning levels, which like I could rant about for years, but we won't, because that's another rant for another day. But I think because of that, a lot of times neurotypical folks tend to approach different disabilities as like, you are at X level of function at any given time, and think that that is like a static thing, when it's very much not, right? Like I will have stretches of time where I'm like totally nonverbal, and other stretches of time where I like can't stop talking. And if people expect the same each day out of their students, I think that's setting everybody up for disappointment.
Yeah, in general, in the world with like disability stuff, I would like to see it approaches more like a color wheel and like these are the challenges and strengths this person has rather than just like the 1 bar spectrum. I'd really like to see that.
Yeah, I also loved what Keegan said about making sure that there's a space where students feel safe enough to disclose their needs. I think that's huge. Speaking from experience, I kind of have a unique experience because the majority of my time in the marching arts, I was undiagnosed ADHD. And I actually just found out before my age out season this past year. And so many things just like made sense. I always sort of struggled with my communication with staff, which being in my position as head conductor is a very unique experience with kind of constant, really open communication with staff members and not understanding why sometimes they would interpret my things I said or the way I communicated that with them in a specific way, like as if I was being blunt or being even thinking that I had an attitude or any of these things when in the moment I thought I was just communicating clearly without emotion. So I definitely struggled telling my staff. I have a great staff, love them. They were fantastic, but I did struggle to tell them because of the social implications of having a neurodisability and the way I was very worried about being seen as having a disability, being seen as being less capable or less fit or weak or all these different things that might be negative connotations that come along with some of these experiences, as along with I struggle with anxiety and depression. So just all of those things together, sometimes I had a hard time disclosing those to staff members, not necessarily because they didn't create that space, but because of the baggage that I carried with my diagnosis. And if there had been some sort of extra effort, I think from staff members, then maybe I would have felt more comfortable communicating my needs.
Yeah, that's a great point. And all of you have kind of touched on this already, but I do want to ask the question specifically is, should cores kind of take the initiative then by offering some kind of form of self-disclosure for contracted members? We're not saying in audition camps or early on, but for members who have made the commitment to join the core, should there be a level of self-disclosure on their end to maybe work with the core? If so, there may be implications to this, but I'd love to hear your extended thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I think that obviously in my opinion, I think it would be very important for like administrative staff to take all these things in mind, and I think it would be very important for neurodiverse people to kind of, if they are comfortable with it, talking to staff and talking to admin about how exactly they need to be, exactly their needs. Because I know that one of the last things that any tech wants to happen is that they make a comment to someone about something they noticed at a rep, and then they later find out that the reason why they messed up during a rep was because of something it was because of their disability, like making it harder to achieve that. And so it would be unfair not only to the member but also to the staff. So I think it's not only a conversation of communicating from member to admin, but also member to staff or admin to staff.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Marco said. I think also I feel pretty strongly that this can be a really positive thing, having some sort of self-reporting, if and only if first there is diversity training with staff members of all types, diversity of ethnicity, race, different religious affiliations and neurodiversity. I think that learning first how to approach students with empathy to their condition and things that they can't control, and learning how to approach and teach different students, so that, again, staff members can understand what these different neurodiversities mean and what they may not mean as well, and how they should be interacting with students of this type.
Yeah, I had kind of the same concerns as Claire did, because it's like, it could be really positive if the staff knows what to do with that, and it could be detrimental if they don't have that knowledge. That, and like, I'm aware that not everyone that's teaching drunk core or anything like that necessarily works in the education field, which that's cool. And then they might just not really be educated on working with diverse students and what their needs would be. That being said, even in different regions of the country or just even outside of the US, there's a variety in regions of like the amount of just how informed people are about that. Although, like Keegan said earlier in this panel, there's more to be desired with understanding of disability and education, but it's just there needs to be just some more for that. But it could be really good if we worked on that.
Well, and I would love to see, and maybe this is like honestly a project that just needs to happen internally. But I would love to see like marching specific diversity training by like diverse groups. Because I think a lot of times like the like required modules that we all do for like every education job are often like well-meaning but a bit misguided and clearly written by like neurotypicals who like kind of get it but like kind of don't. And I worry that, especially because of how just weird the marching arts are, that using like general diversity training might not solve a lot of the potential issues that would come up. For context of like why that's kind of on my mind, I did my master's research on Team Japan and how staff members communicate with Japanese students in DCI and all that. And like the biggest recurring theme was essentially that, right? Everything we know about intercultural communication like doesn't super apply in the marching arts. And in research that I've looked at by other people who have done like marching arts sociology and communication research, that's like a pretty recurring theme across like, language barriers and ethnicity and race and socioeconomic barriers and like all kinds of other things. And so while there hasn't been, as far as I know, any specific disability studies work in the marching arts sphere on that topic, I would certainly assume the trend would also be true there, where, DCI is such a like isolated subculture that our understanding of dealing with diverse populations in a general sense tends to not apply to what people self-report as their needs within the marching arts. And so I feel like some kind of collection of diversity materials or some kind of collection of conversations, and obviously this probably is a helpful first step of that, but some kind of work done specifically on like marching arts diversity training, I think would be really, really helpful for that.
Absolutely. And I mean, for me at least, I didn't receive my diagnosis until well after I marched. So at the time, I just assumed that I was hitting my wall really hard at certain times. And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way. But in cases like that, it's going to take a while. I don't think we should expect every corps to do diversity training to adhere to those who are neurodivergent by 2022. But in the meantime, I mean, we've seen corps really be proactive and offer physical trainers and other medical staff jobs to reduce the likelihood of injury for marchers. Should corps at least now prioritize hiring mental health professionals, or at least one, to support students who are neurodiverse or those who may just need it for their own mental health reasons while on tour?
So this is one that I'm like really stoked to talk about because I had one on accident. In 2016, we had a dude volunteer on the food truck who happened to like also have his master's in psychology and was like a clinical practitioner. I don't know psych words. I just have one. So if that's the wrong term for them, sorry. He was like a psychologist. But I like, obviously that wasn't like his job on tour, but at one point in the season when I was like really going through it, I just remember like talking to him just as like a person I had chatted with a lot throughout the season and felt close to and comfortable with. And like mentioning to him that I was like struggling with some stuff. And he was like, "Oh, you want to like work through some stuff? I'm like a counselor." And I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And I just remember that like 10-minute middle of lunch conversation and going through just a couple like methods that worked for him. And specifically, that was the first time that I had worked on, I can't think of the term for it now, but basically when you tend to like immediately jump to the worst case scenario in everything, that sort of method of being like, okay, but what's the actual worst that can happen? And how bad is it actually going to be? And how likely is that? And that sort of like de-escalating by being kind of more realistic about things is like a skill that my current psychologist loves and brings up all the time. But the first time I learned it and used that skill that I still use now, like 5 years later, and it's very effective for me, was just like at the food truck, because we had 10 minutes while I was eating lunch to have a conversation. And I think having like a dedicated mental health professional who can have those conversations when students need it is like invaluable.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is super, super important that corps prioritize having some sort of professional who is well-versed in mental health on their staff. Simply because when you look at the typical member experience, every, few people are going to sprain their knee or like have an actual physical injury at some point in the season. While I guarantee that 9 out of 10 members, if at the very least, are going to struggle with something mentally throughout the season. So it is widely spread on how it affects membership in terms of mental health. And I would argue even more common to experience than physical health issues, even though that's definitely an important subject, obviously, in the activity. But I think that having someone designated who not only is a person that the membership trusts, but is also qualified to be helping them with these different things is really important. I know a lot of the time, like our physical trainers and things tend to be those people who those responsibilities fall on, but they're not always trained in mental health, especially if they're a physical therapist or an athletic trainer or things like that. They might not have any mental health experience. So it's important to have other people who can fill in those gaps. Like, for instance, at Regiment, we had a nurse who was experienced in mental health as well. And she was really, really helpful when we had people who were struggling. We could send them to her and we knew that they were taken care of and their needs were being heard by her. But with that being said, I think it's also can be important to give members the resources to see their own mental health professionals during tour. For instance, I saw my therapist over tour a couple of times, and I was never shamed for missing rehearsal to do this. I told my director, and he would essentially tell staff, Claire won't be here from this time to this time. And there were no questions asked essentially about that. And that was really helpful. That made me feel very safe and comfortable seeing my own therapist on tour, which is important, especially with someone with a neuro divergence, to have that consistency with the same person. I think it's important that they have those resources.
I kind of think, and I agree that we definitely need to have someone on tour who is qualified to be giving mental health help, not even just for students to talk to, but to get staff to understand that kind of thing also. But I really think also they should be qualified to work with neurodivergent people as well, because being somebody that works in a mental health field and is working on becoming a therapist, I think a lot of the dialogue is centered on kind of what neurotypicals think they know about ADHD and autism, particularly autism, for me at least. That's just my personal experience. That might happen with ADHD as well. But with both of them, it's also kind of just like not as much as known about the experience of having it in being an adult. We really need to understand and listen to the perspectives of the person who has it. I think there needs to be more of that. So it really should be a professional that is competent with that, I think.
Yeah, I feel like the same way. So a little back, so a little story. My sister is actually a social worker, and whenever she would go out for a job interview, almost every single one, she would talk about how one of the questions they would ask is, "What is your experience with people with people with disabilities, like teaching them or whatever?" And so I feel like implementing that same kind of process into hiring professionals in these activities, I feel like that would be very beneficial, because as we've kind of like talked about a lot before, being neurodivergent is not black or white, nor is it even gray. It's like pretty much every single color that there is, because like no two autistic people, no two people with ADHD, no two neurodivergent people will be the exact same. So having that professional who has that experience with working with people with neurodivergence, having them be a resource not only for the members but also to the staff, kind of like relating back to what we were talking about before, that will help with not only having members have a very safe experience, but also helping the staff ensure that that experience is safe.
Yeah. I really, really super like what Claire said about like giving people space to meet with their own therapists or counselors or whatever their care team might be. It's just had my wheels turning a little bit. And even like, again, it comes back to this, like, the marching arts are really, really, really unique. And so any research and understanding we have of other things isn't necessarily going to apply to our weird world. And because of that, yes, I think corps should have mental health staff, even if it's just somebody on call who's available for like telehealth, like something for the members. But I think it's so much to ask somebody for one person to understand like the weird nuances of our activity, and also sports psychology, and also various neurodivergences, and also like social psychology, because it's an athletic activity where we're dealing with the unique kinds of overtraining, burnout, and the like performance anxiety and all of the things that come along with like sports psychology. But also it's this like sort of parasocial like little bubble where we all like disappear into, and our entire social life takes place in that bubble for a couple months. And everything about it is slightly different than the real world. And there's so much like nuance to that I think understanding all of that and then understanding 165 plus, what's the new, a lot of people, but give it like 2 years, it'll be an even 200. But like understanding the individual needs of every single member, plus all of the nuances of the activity, and somehow having a background in neurodivergence and sports psychology and social psychology and intercultural communication. And like, there's just so much to ask that like, while I think it's important, I think the biggest thing we need to do is shift away from this mentality of like taking time away from rehearsing is like the greatest evil that you can do. Because like I'm super into like endurance sport, and I think I made a Facebook post about this a few months ago when I was angry about it for some reason. But like I'm really into endurance sports, and I follow a lot of like 100-mile, 200-mile racers whose like entire athletic career is working out for 36 hours straight, and they don't do 4-hour blocks 3 times a day, 7 days a week. Like the training load that we put on marching arts athletes is wild and like a little bit unsustainable. And so the idea that like taking an hour away from that to meet with a counselor and to like have a check-in, like the idea that that lost hour is going to do more harm than good is just wild, right? Because we're already well over the overtraining threshold where like taking decompression breaks from that constant training is good for you. Like we know that physically and mentally. We have the research to know that like you shouldn't train that much. So if we're going to do it anyway, I think staff need to get a lot more comfortable with the idea that like a student taking an hour out of block once a week to meet with a professional and like get that mental reset, I promise the other 11 hours of that day are going to be much more effective rehearsal than if you just make them like work all day without that. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I have seen cores, thankfully, cores have changed over the last couple of years and being more accommodating. But even when I marched, I know there was a point in the season when I think the staff started to realize that the members were getting a little bogged down by everything and were giving us a block off to do what we wish. And some people decided to do yoga. Some people tried to recoup in a different way. But you also brought up the great point of it's a little unrealistic almost to have someone who's experienced in the marching arts and everything else under this giant umbrella. So we can talk a lot about kind of what we can do for ourselves almost in a bit. So that's my final question is I'd love to hear what you face, challenges you all faced while you marched and also how you were able to help yourself along the way. And we will keep this one a little shorter. We do have some community questions and we welcome more. So we'll jump into that fourth question and then we'll take some community questions as well.
For me, it was a couple different things. So for me, it was kind of like the executive functioning piece with like trying to get all your stuff together during like EPAC load or whatever. That was very overwhelming for me. And at least my first year, I was almost always running late. My second year, it got better. So that was incredibly stressful. Sometimes I was overstimulated and overpeopled, and that made long days really hard as well. Because sometimes I'd be really agitated, and other days I'd just be like, just can't. And then the last piece was like just the socialization aspect. My first year, I got along better with like quite a few people. And then my second year, I didn't vibe with as many people. And I was there weren't very many like age outs. It was a lot of younger people. A lot of the people that I did my rookie year with were gone. So I never got in the groove of like being close with too many people again. And I think that impacted my mental health because it's really important to get to know other people on tour.
Yeah, there were a lot of ways in which my ADHD affected me over tour, both positive and negative. I do want to say that one positive way that I found I thrived being neurodivergent was with the structure of drum corps. I am the type of person who needs structure and thrives on structure, but cannot for the life of me create it for myself. So having drum corps where I don't have to make any decisions, all of my entire day is planned out by someone else, and I don't have to think in any way about it. I just adhere to the schedule, was fantastic for me, and I felt like I really thrived off of that, and I was able to wake up every morning, have my routine, and really thrive throughout the day. Where I struggled was just pure exhaustion, mental exhaustion, masking all day, especially being in this huge leadership position that I was in. And from the minute I woke up to the minute I went to bed, thinking about other people rather than myself, like ahead of myself, meaning that I had very little time to take care of myself and do what I needed to be in a mentally stable place, meant that I was just exhausted all of the time. So once I was done with rehearsal, pretty much I had just enough energy left to shower and brush my teeth, and then I was tanked for the rest of the night. And most people were able to shower and then socialize a little bit with their free time or read or do different things. And most nights I did not have the energy to do any of those things, and I just showered and immediately went to bed. And luckily, I was on a conductor team that would allow me to do that and would take care of our evening responsibilities, like making sure everyone's in bed, because I was also usually the first one up. So that really helped. Other ways I struggled with my neurodivergence has been communication with my staff, especially my first few years was really rough. Communication, I think that I had my mentor who I was very close with and who understood me really well, knew about all of my mental health situations and that type of thing. And we had a great relationship. The rest of the staff didn't know about those different things I was dealing with, like my anxiety and my depression, and even my ADHD, they weren't aware of. So I think that they would occasionally expect me to communicate with them a certain way, and then when I communicated in the style that I did, it wasn't always received in the way that I meant it or the way that I would have hoped. I think that occasionally they would read deeper into my things I would sing and assume that I was like, for instance, I asked a lot of questions on the podium when there's timing issues. I immediately am asking all these different questions because I'm trying to figure out how to make it perfect the next time. And a lot of the times me asking questions was interpreted as me not thinking that the staff was giving me valid feedback, or thinking that I was questioning the staff's feedback rather than understanding that my questions was just me trying to suss out exactly what the staff was telling me. And that occasionally caused issues that I didn't understand. Then, I could tell that the staff was mad at me, but I would have no clue why. And then my anxiety starts to run and cause other challenges for me as well. So communication just in general was really difficult, especially communicating from a neurodivergent point of view to neurotypicals. I found was really difficult, especially in that intimate setting where I'm kind of in my job, I'm sort of half a member and half a staff member. I feel like I kind of get the responsibilities of a member without really the perks of getting to not worry about other people, and then the responsibilities of a staff member where I have to be responsible for all these people without the perks of being a staff member where I get to, have fun with the other staff members and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I all of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up are things that Claire mentioned. I just want to approach them a little bit from like a educator side, since I've been like teaching marching arts for a couple years. And one of the biggest things that I remember is super similar to what Claire was saying about like people misunderstanding when you have like good intentions, especially with like looking for clarification and stuff. I think there's a little bit, and it's less so than it used to be, but there is still that little bit of like old school drum corps mentality of like, just smile and say yes. Don't question it. And often I think the questions are not like, I'm questioning it because I disagree with your design philosophy. Cause like I'm 19. I don't have a design philosophy yet. But rather like looking for clarification, or like people genuinely wanting to make sure they do things right and like meaning really well. I think a lot of times you see students, especially younger students, who like really just want to do good and just like really want to do the right thing and are like seeking like clarification and affirmation, and are met with like, don't ask questions, just do it. And you're like, but what am I doing? And to that end, like obviously one, I think staff members just need to, like, if you are an educator, approach your students with the assumption that they mean well. Like, just assume that your students want to be successful and that they are asking questions because they want to succeed. And I think if you approach them with that assumption instead of assuming that they're like questioning you or it's like negative, I think that just is better for everybody. But two, as a marcher, I think something super important is just finding like a person or people that understand and will like help. It was always really helpful for me to have a couple people both in my section and out of my section who I knew like understood that sometimes staff gives directions and my brain just goes, nope, those aren't words. And so having people who I could trust to lean over and be like, what did they just say? Who would be like, oh, this, and this, instead of like, you know, like shushing you or like, why are you talking when the box is talking or whatever other thing people would normally do. Having people who you know are going to like support you and give you that extra feedback and that extra help you need is like monumental. So kind of finding that group as early as you can, I think, is huge.
Yeah. So in my experience, a lot of my experiences are kind of like a combination of everyone's experiences that we've heard so far. So like for me, some of the biggest challenges for me as an autistic person, especially in the marching arts, involve communication and also kind of thinking, and also just kind of like thinking ahead and thinking exactly every single thing I need to do. So, for example, like my last year, this past summer, I was on the leadership team, and there was a part of me that feared, there was a part of me that feared that I was not going to be the best leader because logistically I am not the best resource, because sometimes I won't know exactly where to go and what to do and how to do it. And, you know, as people have said before, it's whenever I try to ask as many questions as I can. Sometimes that could be taken in a negative light. And thankfully, I've never had those kinds of experiences before, because both the staff and the members at Scouts and at X and all the organizations I've been in have been extremely kind of like understanding and very supportive of all of this. And in kind of like going back to the whole communication thing, well, some of the biggest things is just like being able to know what to communicate and when to communicate. And that goes for not only being a leader, but also just kind of just being a normal like member of the Corps. Because sometimes I'll have a staff member ask me a question, and unless I have like a script exactly what I want to say, I will stumble every single word. And then then my message comes out skewed, and sometimes I had experiences where a couple of my other people kind of like question why I do that, and sometimes and I don't want to say I was made fun of for that, but sometimes I've had people who would just kind of like question like why do you always kind of like stutter when you're like talking to somebody, like why do you always do this, and it's just part of being part of my autism. It's like it's very, very difficult for me to really know exactly what I want to say and how to say it, especially when it's right on the spot. And so that's why a lot of times I will always practice what I will say, even if it's like something very, very minuscule. And what has always helped me during that time has been like the people I have marched with. Like during my summer, like I've hung out with one of my best friends in the entire Corps, was a fellow autistic person, and we would often kind of like chat about, you know, moments where we feel very overwhelmed by something, or sometimes we talk about stuff that's going on in our personal lives and how we can kind of apply what we're what we're experiencing, how we can apply that, how we can incorporate that into you know, doing the best we can in the marching arts. So I think a lot of what has really helped me has been both the members and the staff being extremely understanding and always willing to be very cooperative.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned having to make sure everything is written out, because I've had this entire night scripted out in front of me this entire time. So I completely get it. We do have some community questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, because there are quite a few. But I would love to hear your inputs on this. We've talked a lot about tour and how that whole process can go, but I do want to back us up to the beginning of audition camps. For a lot of people, auditions are already very cutthroat to begin with. And for someone who is neurodivergent and stepping into that role for the first time, stepping into a room where they might not know anybody, and then have to audition amongst a bunch of others, is there a way that can really add to that experience and make it a little better for them?
I think I have like two different planks of going back to the same, like just find people, like find your people early and often. But one, I think pretty much every organization at this point puts up like interest groups on Facebook and stuff. So you can have like, you know, there is some community building that happens pre-auditions. And I think taking advantage of that as much as you can is huge. And like, even, you know, finding one or two people who are auditioning for the same instrument, or who have like some shared interest that you discover from like another Facebook group or whatever it is, you know, like even if you find two other people and make a group chat, like it doesn't have to be, you know, you're constantly participating in that space, because that can be a ton of people and a little overwhelming, but like at least keeping tabs on it and trying to create like one or two relationships within that group can be huge for having someone just to like go to camp with and interact with. And then also just like convince your friends to audition with you, because you probably also, if you're deep enough in this nonsense that you're going to do it all summer, you probably have friends who are also pretty deep. And I think a lot of times people don't audition because they're like, oh, well, you know, I probably won't make it, or I don't have money to march, or whatever it is. But like, if you have the money to go to an audition camp and not march, like that's fine. Get a weekend of world-class instruction from really smart people and like get better at your instrument, you know? Like think of it as a weekend masterclass where at the end they might say, hey, we really like you. And you have to say, yeah, sorry, I'm not doing it this year. But you know, if you can find a friend who is like on the fence or might want that audition experience but doesn't plan to march or whatever it is, and you can like give them that extra push to come with you, like having somebody with you is super, super, super helpful. Like one huge thing for me was auditioning with other people from Pioneer, because, you know, I marched Pio in 2013, and then I showed up to auditions at Regiment in 2014, and there were a couple other people I had marched Pioneer with. And so immediately it was like, okay, there's someone here who I know, there's someone who is like safe and present. And then I got lucky, and one of those Pioneer people also made the horn line that year. And so I had that like safety person for a whole season. But especially for auditions, having that connection is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Keegan said, I would not have shown up to my audition if it weren't for two other friends from my high school who were going to the same audition, because that felt like a safety net for me to be able to go and have something that's familiar at this very unfamiliar place. I think the other thing for me and my ADHD is knowing what to expect at an audition. And for this, I would say don't be afraid to reach out to staff members, or even if you can't reach out to staff members, it's great to find someone who has gone through the audition process prior, who can tell you, this is what we did the first day, this is what we did the first block, this is what we did the second day, walk you through what that process is going to look like so you know what to expect. Because for me, that made me feel immensely more comfortable when I was in this really unfamiliar, stressful, anxiety-inducing environment. So yeah, those would be my biggest recommendations.
All right. Well, because of time, I think we are going to call it wraps for the town hall tonight. Thank you all very much for our panelists. Your insight has been very helpful, and I hope conversations like this continue to happen behind closed doors at different corps and marching ensembles in the off season. And hopefully we do see some positive change over the next couple of years, because as we've all mentioned, it's very much needed. In November, MAASIN will be hosting a Life After Aging Out town hall, discussing the various ways we can move on from the activity or not after we age out. We also have a few workshops coming up, including how to find a job in the marching arts and how to support your fellow staff. Be sure to follow MAASIN on our social media platforms so you can see the schedule. And until next time, I want to thank you all and see you soon.